Hello and welcome back to the channel. My name is Ricky Fraley and today I'll be going over the case of a Soviet serial killer. Obviously, I am an American, so pronouncing Soviet names, Russian names, anything to do with the Cyrillic alphabet, I will probably be horrible at, so please don't judge me on that. But today, the guy who we'll be talking about is Aleksey Vasilyevich Sukletin. He garnered a couple names throughout his, what you could call a career as a serial killer. He went by the Vasilyevo Cannibal, the Kazan Ogre, and the Volga Alligator, amongst a couple of others. He gained those names because of some of the pretty gruesome stuff that he did. He was a cannibal. But before I get into that, I want to start by saying, guys, if you see something, say something. It's as simple as that. I understand that not every crime can be stopped in the moment that it's happening, but if you see something and you suspect something is going on, whether it be any kind of human trafficking, any kind of kidnapping, anything like that where someone's life is at stake, or anything really, say something, do something. I mean, I'm not saying to put yourself in danger, obviously. We don't want that. We want to prevent any kind of injury or casualty or anything like that. But saying something can prevent things from getting worse for people. You'll see that in this case, back in the 70s and 80s, well, late 70s and early 80s, when Aleksey was active as a serial killer, if people back then had known to say something when they saw things, or come forward to the authorities or anything, his reign of terror could have been stopped a lot quicker. But I mean, you do have to kind of give them a little leeway. Back then, in the Soviet Union, they hadn't had a serial killer craze. I doubt that they even knew what a serial killer was, that anybody could be as depraved as some people like Mr. Sukletin here ended up being. So they probably weren't looking out for the signs of that. But now onto the timeline for Mr. Sukletin. Aleksey Vasilyevich Sukletin was born to an unnamed mother and unknown father on March 23rd, 1943. His mother was a military field hospital nurse. He was born in Kazan, which is in the Soviet Republic state of Tatarstan in modern-day Russia. Here's a little bit of a gap of information due to both time passing and this being information on somebody who lived in the Soviet Union 50, 60 years ago now, and I live in the US. We don't really generally have that much information about time back then. But skipping forward to 1960, in February of this year, he committed his first crime that is on record. The then 16-year-old Aleksey attacked a girl in the night by hitting her on the head with a heavy object and attempting to sexually assault her. Thankfully, she was saved by two passing men who intervened, and the resulting scuffle ended in Sukletin being arrested. Sukletin was then sentenced to 2 years in a youth detention center. As he was a minor at the time, he was 17. Since this was in February, he would have turned 18 on March 23rd of 1960. He was then moved to a corrective labor colony when he was old enough, upon turning 18 on March 23rd. I assume. It was in this time at the corrective labor colony that he picked up a penchant for reading. He was pretty intelligent, and that came to be a problem later on in his life, at least for the people around him. In the years between his arrest and sentencing and the year of 1964, he made acquaintances with other young men with similar lifestyles as him, i.e. criminality. And they would often drink together. This was the start to a budding alcoholism that he had for the rest of his life, pretty much. Once the group of them ran out of money for alcohol, however, Sukletin informed the rest of them that there was an elderly woman that lived nearby that they could all rob for money. The group of young men then broke into the elderly woman's house and beat her. They attacked her on the back of the head with a heavy object and stole 80 rubles from her. I was not able to find any kind of information on the exchange rate or how much that 80 rubles would be worth today in buying power. So I just assumed that it was enough, I guess, for them to get drunk but obviously no amount of money is enough to justify illegally entering someone's home and attacking them in any way. However, fortunately, the woman survived and was able to report the crime to the police. The men were apprehended within a few hours of committing the crime, actually in the nearest bar. Sukletin was subsequently sentenced to 12 years behind bars for his part in the crime. Skipping forward 12 years now, in 1976, Sukletin was released from prison. He picked up a job at an insurance company, but was promptly fired for not actually showing up to work. Next, he went to work as a security guard for a horticultural association, but was fired for often missing work there as well. 2 years later, in 1978, he became an orderly at a psychiatric hospital, and then in 1979, he left that hospital and went back to being a security guard, but this time for a garden community named Cannibal in the settlement of Vasilyevo. It was here in Vasilyevo that he met a 23-year-old woman by the name of Medina Sharakova, and they started living together. He told her that he was serving a sentence at the Kazakh camp, but that he had escaped. Before meeting Sukletin, Sharakova had gone to Uzbekistan for work and then moved to Kazan, where she worked a few different jobs. She had a child that she abandoned, and that child lived with her parents when she began living with Sukletin. Shortly after moving in together, the two would begin committing crimes together. 1979 is an important year in this case, as this is not only the year that he met Medina Sharkova, but it is also the year that he committed his first homicide in the string that would make him a serial killer. Jumping forward to the end of his reign of terror, in 1985 he was apprehended by the authorities for his crimes, and then in 1987, on July 29th, he was executed by firing squad at the age of 44. Alright, on to the crimes. I want to preface this by saying that while I will be speaking about these as if they're just journal entries or whatever, I don't want to be disrespectful at all. Each and every one of these crimes, except for the first one, is someone who has lost their life or who had lost their life at the time. And I want to be completely respectful of that fact. So, starting in 1979, his first crime with Sharakova was one of extortion. You see, Sukletin sent Sharakova from Vasilyevo into Kazan, and then she took a taxi back to Vasilyevo late in the afternoon. She told the taxi driver about how her husband was cheating on her in order to gain his trust and his sympathy. And when they got back to the house that she shared with Sukletin, she offered for the taxi driver to spend a night with her, and for some reason he said yes. That night, Sukletin, who was playing the role of the angry husband, and one of his other accomplices, one of the men that he was often drinking with, a man by the name of Rinat Volkov, who played the role of Sharakova's brother in this scheme, burst into the bedroom where they were staying, and they beat the taxi driver while taking photos of him in compromising positions. So they busted in acting like an upset, angry husband who was getting cheated on, and the wife's brother, who was also there angry that he was getting cheated on. And they beat him up, and they took photos of him in positions and in ways that would look very, very bad. I mean, they didn't get into detail, but I'm assuming various states of undress and in various positions that you just don't want to be seen in. After taking these photos, they demanded money from him. They demanded approximately 200 rubles from him, or else they were going to release the photos to the general public. He complied and paid them the next day, which, I mean, considering what's coming next, he got lucky. He may have been beaten. I mean, I don't want to say he was lucky because he still got, this was a crime. I mean, they beat him up, they took explicit photos of him, extorted his money, he lost 200 rubles. I don't even know how much that is, but it's more than the 80 they got from the lady that they beat before. I mean, but still he got lucky compared to what's coming up. So, later that year, in November of 1979, Sukletin invited a 22-year-old woman by the name of Ekaterina Osetrova, hope I pronounced that right, into his home, where he introduced Sharakova as his sister. According to some sources, including Sukletin himself, she was a prostitute. The three of them had a feast, and then Osetrova and Sukletin went into the bedroom and they did the deed. After they got done, Sharakova offered her a drink, and while she was distracted by Sharakova, Sukletin hit her in the back of the head with a hammer wrapped in cloth. So he's developing a pattern here where he would bludgeon his victims with some kind of heavy or blunt object. This time it was a hammer that was wrapped in cloth. Sukletin then put her into a trough, tied her hands, and slit her throat in order to kill her. He claims to have drank her blood while she was still bleeding out. He then reportedly made Sharakova drink some as well. After Osetrova passed away from the bleeding, he hung her corpse up, all while joking about the crime that he was committing. He cut away her flesh and organs with the help of Sharakova, and they dumped the rest of her blood down the bath drain. Sukletin then consumed her heart, liver, and lungs, and had Sharakova prepare borscht and pelmeni, which I assume are different types of Soviet or Russian foods, from her flesh, which they eventually ate together. They fed some of the rest of the meat to their dogs and then buried her bones under a nearby water tower. Osetrova was the only victim in the 70s. Obviously, that took place in November of 1979. Next, in the early 1980s, victim number 2. In January of 1980, so just a couple months after Osetrova, Sukletin committed his second murder. He and Sharakova went out in order to celebrate the new year, and they ended up meeting 2 women whom they invited to celebrate with them. During that night, he killed and ate one of them. Her name was Tatiana Ilarianova. He did this without touching the other. When she woke up in the morning and asked about Tatiana, she was told that she woke up early in the morning and that she went to Kazan. The friend then left, and while she came out of the situation unscathed, this is one of the points where if somebody had realized or said something, she just believed what Sukletin and I suppose Sharakova said, that she just got up and left without saying anything or doing anything. Now, while it's impossible for me to tell whether she thought that was suspicious or not, I do know from just what I was able to research that nothing came out of this, that she just left, and I guess she took them at their word. Victim number 3 was a teenager, either 15 or 16 years old. None of my sources were exactly clear on that, and her name was Razeda Galimova. Sukletin lured her into his dacha, which I googled and it said it was a middle upper class estate, so his home. He then sexually assaulted her and then hit her on the head twice with a cloth wrapped hammer, so there's that same method again. She reportedly begged Sharakova, who was in attendance watching it happen, to help her. But she just stood by, didn't do anything, and eventually took her sweater after she passed away. And it's important to note that all of Sukletin's murders took place in the same way, where he would use a blunt force or a blunt object or a heavy object, and then exsanguinate them. Exsanguination meaning have them bleed out. So that brings us to victim number 4, a woman by the name of Nadezhda Sityavina. After he was done consuming and disposing of the remains of Galimova, Sukletin lured the 22-year-old Nadezhda into his home. He reportedly told Sharakova that he was going to begin living with Nadezha instead, and even took her to meet his own mother, who at the time lived in Zelenodolsk, before he ultimately killed her and disposed of her remains in the same manner as the previous victims. Victim number 5. A woman by the name of Natalia Shkolnikova. He met her through Nadezha Setyavina before he went through with her murder. Victim number 6. Victim number 6 was the youngest of all of his victims. She was only 11, and her name was Valentina Elikova. Sukletin found her in Kazan and introduced himself to her as her distant uncle in order to gain her trust, and then lured her into his home. Once inside and away from the safety of the general public, he smashed her head against a wall. He sexually assaulted her, and then killed her and ate her in the same manner as the rest of his victims. Interestingly enough, Sharakova did try to intervene and stop him in this case because the girl was so young, but Sukletin was able to overpower her and ended up beating her badly before finishing what he was doing. It was after this crime that he ordered Sharakova to kidnap a baby for him, but he refused and left him, going to live with her parents once again. However, she did not go to the authorities about anything that had transpired in that house, or anything that Sukletin had done up to this. After Sharakova left Sukletin was able to sexually assault one of his friend's daughters. He was able to get to her by lying to them about a nephew that he supposedly had, that lived in Italy, that he had promised to find a bride for. This bride would have been the friend's daughter. So he was able to get alone with her and he assaulted her, like the monster that he was. This leads us into 1985 and the last of his homicides before he was captured. Now, without Sharakova, he was alone. And in early 1985, a 23-year-old alcoholic named Lydia Fyodorova moved in with Sukletin, along with her own relative Anatoly Nikitin. The three of them would drink and party often, but tension began to grow between Sukletin and Fyodorova as she refused to be compliant with any of his crimes, like Sharakova was, and she threatened to expose him to the police, unlike Sharakova. Subsequently, on March 12, 1985, both Sukletin and her relative Nikitin, both of them, sexually assaulted Fyodorova and took her life, going on to consume parts of her corpse and burying her bones with that of the rest of his victims. Sharakova returned to Sukletin 6 days later on March 18th and helped to conceal the crime by cleaning the crime scene and washing the bloody clothes. So even after leaving, even after being disgusted at the fact that his previous victim was 11 and that he had asked her to kidnap a baby for him to do these things to, and leaving, she still came back and tried to help him conceal his crimes. This, however, was the last crime that he would get away with, because when people noticed that Fyodorova had gone missing, people started to ask questions. The police went to Sukletin's house to question him in connection with her disappearance, but were unable to get any information or evidence, as he told them that he had no clue on the subject of her whereabouts. Which, I mean, back then, I guess the police work was a little different. Especially, I mean, I don't know how it was over there in the Soviet Union, but police are looking for a missing person. And, well, I guess they didn't really have any reason to suspect him of anything. They just went to his door and knocked and asked, "Hey, do you know where she's at?" He said no, and they said, "All right," and left. As far as the information that I have, as far as that I can tell, that's what happened. However, it was this crime that ultimately led into his capture. There are two stories about how Sukletin came under suspicion and then was subsequently arrested for the crime. Story number 1. A man named Gennady Uglov asked Sukletin where Fyodorova was, and Sukletin told him where he buried the remains of his victims. He just said, hey, she's up there under that water tower. It's believed that he trusted Uglov not to turn him in, as Uglov asked Sukletin to sign his workbook, which would have been proof that he was not living off the people around him. See, back then in the Soviet Union, I guess they had workbooks which were to keep track of the work that each person was doing. And as a security guard, which Sukletin was, he could sign his workbook saying that Uglov had been working and not just living off of the system, as it was a communist system back then. I guess it technically still is. I'm American, I don't know these things. So, it is assumed that Sukletin figured that because he was doing this favor for Uglov, that Uglov would not turn him in. This, according to this story, that was incorrect. It did not stop him from going to the police on June 3rd and reporting the remains. Initially, the police didn't even believe him, but he was able to convince one of the officers that knew him personally before he went to report the crime. So he had a man on the inside. He was like, hey, I'm not lying. Go up there and check it out. They went and checked it out, found the bones, and went and arrested Sukletin. That is how story number 1 goes. Story number 2. In a book named Serial Killers, Maniacs, and Their Victims by Nikolai Modestov, he says that after Sharakova returned, they went back to their extorting ways. And they ran the same scheme from 1979, the one with the taxi driver. But this time the taxi driver went to the police instead of paying. And once the police got back to his house, they found the passport of one of his victims and some of the remains of another. And that is how they got arrested, according to story number 2 from the book. But either way, on June 4th, 1985, Aleksey Sukletin was arrested for his crimes, and the police uncovered the remains of his victims. Subsequently, Sharakova, Nikitin, and Volkov were also arrested for their involvement in the various crimes. Sukletin reportedly attempted to kill Sharakova as many as 3 times in that time that they were living together. And they allegedly fed the remains of several of their victims to their friends and neighbors without them knowing it. At this time, like I said, in the Soviet Union, the concept of serial killers was not as widespread, and as such, the disappearances were not investigated in connection with one another, and often seemed to be ignored outright. Aleksey Sukletin was eventually tried and convicted of the 7 murders as well as extortion and all of the other things that he did, and he was executed by firing squad on July 29th, 1987. And that's the story of the Vasilyevo Cannibal. But I would like to say one last rest in peace to all of his victims. All of the women whose lives ended prematurely because of this monster. They could have lived long, fruitful, happy lives, but for a combination of circumstances, they were too trusting, or too young, or whatever it was. This man got his hands on them and ended their lives to feed his twisted mind and body, because he was a cannibal, but to feed his sick, twisted desires. And I would like to say rest in peace to all of the victims. And with that, I want to say again, if you see something, say something. The people back then in the Soviet Union and around the world really could have put a stop to this a lot sooner if when somebody saw something, they said something. When someone is silent, that might not necessarily be complicit in the crime if you don't really know, but it doesn't hurt to check. It doesn't hurt to make sure. There's always something more that we can do. But at the same time, don't beat yourself up over not noticing something. It's just how life is. If you do notice, say something. Rest in peace to all the victims.